All right, I did not really prepare remarks. I tend to not do that because my real job is being a federal appellate practitioner. I appear in front of panels of 3 judges at the FISA Circuit Court of Appeals, and one told me a long time ago there are always 3 oral arguments. There's the one you prepare to give, there's the one you actually give, and then there's the one you think of at 2 o'clock the next morning. So I kind of just have taught myself to prepare to answer questions. So I never really have a formal speech. I try to address current issues that I think are of interest to everybody, and we decided that this one, of course, would be the Mueller Report meets the rule of law, which means that we just had the Mueller Report come out, as you well know. Has anyone in the room actually read the 456 pages of large gobbledygook and intricate footnotes, many of which consist of FBI 302 of such and such, page number so and so? Okay, all right. Well, I'm only a little bit ahead of you in that regard. I have read a chunk of it. I have not actually managed to read the entire thing. But the first, it's 2 volumes. The first volume is dedicated toward analyzing what they were supposed to have, what the whole thing was supposed to have been about, which was the entire Russia collusion narrative, blaming the Trump administration and campaign for having conspired with the Russians to influence the election. And of course, that is a big goose egg, as you all know. And then the second part of it, which is actually longer than the first, was the obstruction of justice investigation that allegedly started with President Trump firing Mr. Comey, which of course he had absolutely every right to do as President of the United States, with the director of the FBI having ticked off everybody in the country with the way he handled the Hillary Clinton mess and violated every part of his oath of office in his handling of that, and leaked classified information and everything else. So, I mean, my only comment when he fired Comey was he should have done it his first day in office. And if he had done that, of course, we probably wouldn't have found out everything we know now, because it's really in the process of having fired him when he did, and Comey's leaking of his memos that he wrote to himself and to his brethren at the FBI, that we learned how corrupt the upper echelon of the FBI and DOJ and others are. Somebody asked me at the table earlier about my friend Sean Hannity, who always says, no, it's not the 99% of the rank and file of the FBI. Well, yeah, there's a lot more that are than we want to acknowledge. I would guesstimate that at least 30% of all of our federal agencies, including the FBI, are rife with people that should not be there, that are entrenched and enamored with their own power and their own viewpoints of how the country should be run, and don't show the regard for the will of the electorate or the people that they should show. One of the things I think Bill Barr, who is dedicated to the rule of law, will try to change is the overall view of the Department of Justice and restore it to an attitude of service as opposed to engaging in what I call prosecutorial terrorist tactics that Mr. Weissman, who is the lead villain in my book, License to Lie, and of course was actually running the Mueller investigation, likes to use. That is his modus operandi. If there is a way he can demean, degrade, destroy the target of his investigation, that is how he operates. As soon as I heard that Mr. Manafort had had his lock picked at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and his wife searched in gunpoint in their bed in her nightgown, I knew that that was Andrew Weissman. Anything to humiliate, degrade, and demean. I mean, can you imagine any one of you waking up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning finding armed federal agents pointing AK-47s in your face and having to lie there in your bed while somebody searches your wife in her nightgown, claiming that she might have a gun there in the bed with her when you're accused of a tax offense that they supposedly knew about 10 years earlier and decided not to prosecute even under the Obama administration. But since you work for President Trump, they're going to go ahead and do it now because that's great leverage for them to go ahead and pressure you to try to get information against the president. And the goal of all of it, I don't care what anybody else says, was to try to find anything they could find to destroy this president. Hence the t-shirt I created and the website creepsonamission.com. It's Robert Mueller and Andrew Weissman, James Comey, Bruce Orr from the Department of Justice, Lisa Page, Peter Stroke, and Andrew McCabe behind a battered seal of the Department of Just Us. And the eagle's got his wing across his face like this in sheer shame and hanging his head. And if you go on the website creepsonamission.com and blow up the artwork, the artist put some really great detail in there, like Comey's got his thumb on the hit delete button for 33,000 Clinton emails and a few other tidbits that you will find amusing if you've read the book in detail and followed what goes on with the Mueller Report and everything in the news now. So the collusion narrative is now blown out of the water. I think everybody, well, except for Chris Wallace and a few other people who just, Adam Schiff and Jerry Nadler maybe. You know, there are a few that still don't seem to want to give up. Just the word collusion sent me over the edge, because one of the things I've noticed is this entire group of people, predominantly Democrats or progressives, or I call them regressive communists is what I call them, are trying to change the language. And they take a word that has no legal meaning, and then they try to give it a new meaning in law and use it to smear people. They did the same thing, and then it trivializes also what the real meaning of the word is. It's a dangerous thing that's going on in our language. They did the same with the term sexual assault, which in the law means rape. It doesn't mean, you know, a fumbling attempt at whatever at a party when both people or one person is intoxicated and no clothes come off and no body parts are shown. That is not sexual assault. Sexual assault is rape. So this whole collusion notion is just a smear that they started over 2 years ago now, really before Trump was even elected. I think the word might have been used the first time. And of course it didn't take hold until Trump won the election, and then it really got promoted in the media, and that's how they started the whole mess. But the reason they did it, and this is where everybody needs to keep their focus, the reason they did it is because the Obama administration was illegally spying for political purposes using the NSA database and giving private contractors access to the raw NSA data as far back, at least as far back as 2015. We know that from a heavily redacted decision of the FISA Court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Court. It's a 99-page decision. It's linked in some of my articles on my website at sydneypowell.com. But it's written by Rosemary Collier, the Chief Judge of the FISA Court. She wrote it not long after the FBI and Department of Justice rushed to the FISA Court to push through the FISA application on Carter Page. They did that just the weekend before Admiral Rogers blew the whistle on his discovery of the abuses of the NSA database. And I think she might have even have signed that first FISA application on Carter Page. And then just a few days later, she realizes that they had been lying to her about the whole thing. Why the FISA judges haven't done anything else, I don't know. Yeah, I am still livid about all of that, because if I'd been one of them, I'd have had their careers back in there, holding them in contempt under an order to show cause why they shouldn't be held in contempt, and had some heads rolling. But I'm assuming there are things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. We do know there is a massive Inspector General investigation going on, but I really think one of the reasons the Mueller investigation happened was to give cover for all of that and to delay the Inspector General, because Mueller's criminal investigation took priority over everything else within the Department of Justice. It kept the president from doing all kinds of things. It, of course, did cast a cloud over the entire administration. It, of course, did impede his negotiations with Russia and foreign adversaries and friends. It did exactly what the Democrats wanted it to do to a very large extent. But, you know, here we are now. We've made a heck of a lot of progress. But I think the Inspector General's reports in the next 2 months, there are going to be two. There's one that's going to come out in the next, probably within the next 3 weeks, on the leaks and abuses within the FBI. In addition to McCabe's leaks, it's going to focus more on Comey's leaks, as I understand it, and the media interaction with the upper echelon of the FBI. And then there's going to be a whopper one that I bet is longer than the 500-page one that came out previously on the Clinton email issues. There's going to be a doozy on the FISA abuses. I've got a list on my website too, in one of my most recent articles, of all the things that need to be declassified and unredacted. And that includes that decision by Judge Collier on the FISA Court, so that we know who the names of those private contractors are. I saw something today that there may be 4 or 5 private contractors. I would bet the proceeds of the book sales tonight that one of those private contractors is Fusion GPS. Yes. And of course Nellie Orr, because we now know she started with Fusion GPS in 2015, and of course we also know she worked for John Brennan, and we also know that Peter Strzok worked for John Brennan. They were both CIA operatives in addition to everything else they were doing. So it's all interconnected. And I don't know if you know this about Andrew Weissman, but while he was at DOJ this time, first of all, when he was on the Enron Task Force and head of the Enron Task Force in my book, he had been handpicked for that job in part by Robert Mueller. And then even after the atrocities he committed that I documented in the book, and the ethical grievance we filed against him that was very detailed, and even after the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found that he plainly suppressed evidence favorable to the defense, which is an ethical violation of the rules that prosecutors are required to follow, Mr. Mueller still protected and promoted him, as did Christopher Wray, of whom I am not a fan, for obvious reasons. So Weissman gets pulled back into Department of Justice by Leslie Caldwell, who is brought back by Loretta Lynch and Eric Holder. I call them the triple triumvirate of trouble because they all hail from the, I think it's the Eastern District of New York. They all had Mueller connections. They all had connections to the Eastern District of New York, and they all did all kinds of bad things there. Not only were they involved with Mueller and some of his previously shady dealings, but they were all related to the Enron Task Force prosecutions, and they were also all related to Felix Sater, whose name you're going to hear come up. Adam Schiff has already mentioned subpoenaing him. He's mentioned in the Mueller Report. He is a Russian, native-born Russian, who was, I'm pretty sure, implanted in the Trump administration to try to get the Moscow Tower deal done, and has been secretly working with the FBI for more than 20 years because he was charged in a racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization prosecution for which he should have been sent to prison for a long time. And instead, they've kept him as a cooperator literally for 20 years, allowing him to be out on a secret docket pursuant to which he was enabled to swindle other people out of millions of dollars because they didn't even let people know he had been convicted of anything. His victims that I think he swindled out of over $40 million never got restitution because they protected Sater on the secret docket. And guess who signed Mr. Sater's plea deal?
Mr. Mueller.
Andrew Weissman, Mr. Mueller's pit bull. So all you have to do to circle back to any of the trouble in these prosecution abuses is pin the tail on Andrew Weissman. I mean, he just is a bad penny who keeps turning up, and he's always protected and promoted by Robert Mueller. I left the appointment of Mueller as special counsel alone until Andrew Weissman was named to that task force, and then I just was all over it. It's absolutely appalling, and I know some of you have already read the book, but you'll see it even more when you get a chance to read it. And they are and have been truly creeps on a mission to destroy this president. The entire obstruction of justice part of the report I predicted, and I believe I was right, was an effort to smear the president and feed red meat to the Democrats to try to fuel their impeachment effort. Because your first clue that there's absolutely nothing there in the obstruction section is on the second paragraph of page 9, and I will just quote this to you. This is after 2 years of investigation of obstruction. They say, "Here we summarize the law interpreting the elements of potentially relevant obstruction statutes in an ordinary case." Well, if you're talking about potentially relevant statutes after a 2-year investigation, that means you don't have squat. Nothing, nada, zip, zero. And needless to say, this was not an ordinary case because the president had the authority to fire Mueller. He had the authority to fire Comey. He could have fired anybody he wanted to fire, and that would not have been obstruction of justice. The investigation would have continued if it needed to continue. What I find incredibly ironic and ridiculous about the whole thing is they knew, because of Andrew Weissman running a back channel with Bruce Orr at the Department of Justice, who was married to Nellie Orr, working on the Steele dossier with Fusion GPS. And after they fired Christopher Steele on the Steele dossier, they were all working that whole Steele dossier and the FISA applications together behind the scenes. Weissman knew it was all phony. And so when Weissman went to Mueller's task force, Mueller had to have known it was all phony too. And I don't believe for 2 seconds Mueller first heard about this the day he accepted the appointment as special counsel, which just happened to be the day after Comey's leak came out in the New York Times. Not to mention he had interviewed with the president for 4 hours the day before. I would love to get the text messages, and I hope the Attorney General will, between Weissman, Mueller, Comey, Rosenstein for at least a month before and McCabe before special counsel was appointed. Because I think the entire concept of special counsel and who might be special counsel was discussed by those people long before it actually happened. That wouldn't surprise me at all to find that out. In fact, I would be shocked if that were not true. But we shall see. You know, Weissman is in all of it up to his eyeballs. But no, they have absolutely nothing in the way of obstruction. You can look at the 10 instances they like to refer to in the list, and there's nothing there. I looked at each of the statutes they refer to. They don't apply at all. There is an omnibus statute that would come the closest of applying to almost anything anybody might want to call obstruction, The only two courts that have addressed it in anything approaching similar circumstances say that it does not apply to an FBI investigation. And if you really think about what's going on here, they knew from the beginning there was no collusion, there was no criminal conspiracy in tying the president to the Russians whatsoever. So they just ginned up an investigation into absolutely nothing. They knew the president had the right to fire Comey, and they kept an investigation into nothing going for 2 years. Well, to say that the executive branch of the government, which is the Department of Justice and the president, can't shut down an investigation that is absolutely, abjectly, and objectively unreasonable into absolutely nothing is absurd. I mean, we literally wasted $30 million, impeded and impaired the country for 2 years. Frankly, the investigation itself was an obstruction of justice. Yes. And I don't know if you ever noticed this, but I went ballistic when I learned that Mr. Mueller had allowed the destruction of Peter Strzok and Lisa Page's special counsel office cell phones after he was notified by the Inspector General of the bias reflected in their text messages so egregious they both had to leave the special counsel task force and then be fired from their positions with the FBI and DOJ. That is obstruction of justice. All of that information would have been Brady material, evidence exculpatory of the defense as to Manafort and General Flynn, and the prosecutors were under orders by General Flynn's judge at the time to produce any evidence favorable to the defense, and anything that reflected on the conduct of the agents who interviewed Flynn, which was Peter Strzok, would have certainly been Brady material as to Flynn and should have been produced. So, I mean, I wrote an article then saying Mueller should be fired. And of course it didn't happen because everybody was saying, oh, Mr. President, if you do that, you know, they'll charge you with obstruction of justice. And that's what they held over his head, I'm sure, even on the declassification issues. That if you declassify and show the people the truth, we're going to charge you with obstruction of justice. I mean, that is so outrageous, it's just beyond the pale. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. It's just hard to believe what this country's been through the last 2 years and how flat out evil it is. But it is. And I hate to say I saw it coming, but I saw it happen to Senator Ted Stevens. That case is described in the book too. And all these prosecutors were interwoven. The person in charge of the Stevens prosecution was under Andrew Weissman on the Enron task force. And one of the judges who has the Russian troll farm case and the Concord case that involves the officers in Russia who will never show up to be charged with anything happens to be the wife of Matthew Friedrich, who's Weissman's buddy. Yeah, it's incest. Washington, D.C. is the most incestuous place on earth. I really think we need to make everybody there move out and start over.
There's actually a way to do that. With the internet like we have now, we can move every agency to one of the states. There's no need for Washington anymore.
So have you got any other tidbits right now before we go to those questions people submitted, and then we'll rearrange for the camera?
Yes, some people sent in some questions ahead of time. I will try to hit some answers on. I think I've already hit that people want to know when all this started. When did it start getting so bad? I started noticing the politicization and weaponization of DOJ and the agencies, and prosecutors in particular, just starting to take the wrong approach to things literally about 20 years ago. And I think it started as prosecutors realized they could get their names in the paper taking high-profile cases, so they started targeting people with CFO or CFA or CEO behind their names. That was a real popular thing. I've warned accountants, I've spoken at national meetings of accountants and said, listen, you are high-value targets for federal prosecutors. And the same is true for CEOs. It's not good, the whole attitude that they have. And I'm very hopeful that Attorney General Barr will change that. I mean, a federal prosecutor, according to the Supreme Court and according to Robert H. Jackson, who wrote a piece called The Federal Prosecutor back in 1940, is supposed to seek justice, not convictions. And that means if you do a better job in the courtroom of representing the defendant than his own counsel does, that is what you're supposed to do. And back ages ago, when I was a federal prosecutor for 10 years in 3 different districts under 9 different U.S. attorneys, I took a few hits from a few federal judges who were extremely pro-government because I told them they couldn't do certain things with respect to certain defendants that they wanted to be too harsh on. But that was what we were supposed to do. They've lost that, and we've got to get that back. It's not about how many people you can send to prison or how long you can put them there. We have a serious problem in this country of over-criminalization. We try to make a crime out of everything. You know, the old adage, you know, don't make it a federal crime. Well, not everything should be a federal crime. And not everything means you need to go to prison. I mean, we need to rethink considerably what punishments we attach to what offenses, because I think it's 1 in 4 Americans now has a criminal record of some kind. Yeah. Some need it, but some don't. And you know, as much as I despise what Bernie Madoff did and all the harm he caused, I don't think it's especially productive for him to be costing the taxpayers $40,000 a year to be confined in a federal facility when he could be living in Section 8 housing and working 12 hours a day. Forced to serve other people instead of, you know, being caged. And speaking of being caged, they've had Paul Manafort in solitary confinement for 8 months. That's another Weissman tactic. He did it to young Enron treasurer Ben Glisson to get him to cooperate. He went straight from being treasurer of Enron to going into solitary confinement when he voluntarily reported to serve his prison term. And spent 11 days, I think it was, in solitary, which will drive a sane person insane within 24 hours, literally. They start talking to bugs. I mean, it's horrible. Both the ACLU and the UN have decried solitary confinement as torture. And of course, nobody said anything about Paul Manafort being in for 8 months. Media coverage. Somebody asked about media coverage. 90% of the media obviously is controlled. We have American Pravda. James O'Keefe with Project Veritas wrote a book by that name. I thought until I wrote my book that we had freedom of speech and freedom of press. I mean, I paid no attention to politics. I never have been political until I wrote the book, and then I went, holy cow, I can't. People offered to, big name people offered to write a review for the New York Times, wouldn't publish it. Washington Post wouldn't touch it. Amazon shadow banned it. I couldn't get a distributor for it. It has been one story after, I self-published it, which cost me in more ways than one. I just knew that I had to do it myself to get it out there without it being edited or controlled. If I'd gone to a regular publishing house, there would have been a whole lot of problems, including they can decide whether it's ever reprinted, how many copies are printed, all kinds of restrictions on it. So I just kind of did it all myself, and it's been a real education in more ways than one, but our press is controlled. Valerie Jarrett lives with President Obama in his mansion in Kalorama in Washington, D.C., behind a wall, of course, and a fence. They run the organization OFA, and they run about $2 million a day through their operations center there. This is pure speculation on my part, but I think they are the ones generating a lot of the talking points. And remember when we had this series of crisis per week. It was like there was a new crisis every week, and the talking points hit instantly, and they were all the same. I think that's where they're coming from. And I think that's all fed out to the media through the DNC and Obama's group, and they have effectively run a shadow government and control the press from there. Of course, a lot of the press was paid by Fusion GPS. That's something else we need to know. We know from the bank records that one of the House committees got, I think it was Devin Nunes' committee, that Fusion GPS was paying reporters to perpetuate and promote the Russia collusion narrative. We also know that there's an organization called Penn Quarter that was started by Dianne Feinstein's chief of staff, who left her office. His name is Doug Jones, I think. Started the Penn Quarter group right after the election. Immediately, no trouble at all, raised $50 million overnight from California and New York, just a few billionaires, to continue the Russia collusion crap after the election. Now, who got paid that $50 million? And what was that for? They had to be paying people to keep pushing this stuff out.
BuzzFeed.
That too, yeah. And of course, it was BuzzFeed that Clapper and Brennan or whoever leaked to start the whole Steele dossier thing after Comey set the hook with President Trump briefing him only on the salacious aspects of the Steele dossier on January 6th. I mean, these people planned it all. I'm looking at the list of questions.
And do you have that one sheet with the 3 that were submitted from the?
Yes. How can we begin to put impeachment back in the box where it has been for the most part of our history? Well, I think the Democrats have actually tried to impeach every Republican president for a long time. But I think they're realizing it would be a waste of time, but what I think they're going to do is just try to keep the talk of it going. I don't think they're actually going to do articles of impeachment. I mean, I think the really wacko group will, you know, the all-out crazy, as I call her, or actress on call. And Talib and the other one. I think they'll probably try to push it, but I don't think Nancy Pelosi is going to let that go anywhere. But you know, Nadler wants to keep his investigation. They're going to harass the president absolutely as much as they possibly can. I do think White House counsel has a good handle on things, that they will invoke executive privilege and attorney-client privilege and turn the White House into the black box it ought to be in that regard from here on out. Somebody asked a question about immigration, the overwhelming number of migrant families in processing centers. What can Trump and the court system do legally to halt the sea of humanity invading America? I have a very good solution to that. Why I can't get the administration to adopt it, I do not know. There's a provision of United States Code, it's United States Code 1182F, that allows the president to stop all immigration, period. He can make whatever exceptions he wants to make to it. He can still issue non-immigrant visas. He can make it apply to some countries and not others. He pretty much has carte blanche to do what he wants to with it. I even suggested they just do it for everything south of the border, or they could do it for everybody who's let people come from their countries up through our southern border. I mean, there are any number of ways to do it and shut it down. I don't know why they haven't done that. It was approved as recently as Trump versus Hawaii, which is a Supreme Court decision within the last year. It's the best solution. A big problem is the bill that Congress just rammed through in February, I think it was Valentine's Day, funding the government, you know, that the president, people were trying to get him to veto it, and he just felt like we couldn't take another government shutdown. And he signed the blooming thing. Well, there's several poison pills in there that are really, really bad. One of which prohibits even detaining anybody who might be a potential sponsor for an unaccompanied minor child. Yeah, that is just, It's unconscionable, the provisions they put in there, and the Republicans, the rhinos, are every bit as responsible for it as the Democrats are. I mean, we really need to find people to primary everybody who signs that bill. Everybody. All across the country, and all the Democrats who push that need to go, and all the Republicans who push that need to go, including McConnell and absolutely all of them. But there is that one provision, 8 U.S. Code 1182F, and some people heard me say that on a radio station, and they literally bombarded the White House switchboard with calls to invoke that provision and do that. And
would that cover overstayed visas as well?
They can do that automatically. I mean, they already have the authority to do that. But they don't have the agents because they're changing diapers and running hospital service at the border while our veterans aren't getting the medical care they need.
My question relates to impeachment, and I would like to get your opinion on the following. I have a hunch that the Democrats will start impeachment proceedings so that they can say that President Trump is under impeachment, and no president under impeachment should be allowed to get confirmation of a justice to the Supreme Court appointed by him. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's not an unreasonable theory. I wouldn't put that past them.
That's all.
Good for you. Any other elaboration? Somebody's probably dreaming it up.
Yep.
It has been reported that the FBI hired 5 contractors to spy on, maybe Mitt Romney, in 2012. Now, if I'm one of those contractors, why would I not tell the truth if I'm under oath? I've not actually broken any laws. So maybe we learn a lot of good stuff by getting those guys in front of a judge and jury.
I think if they're brought in front of a grand jury, which they should be sometime soon, like after the Inspector General's report comes out, that there will be a lot of people squealing.
Good.
And I expect those names to include Fusion GPS and CrowdStrike, which is another Clinton-affiliated organization. That's also the one that the DNC gave their server to review instead of giving it to the FBI when they claimed they were hacked by the Russians.
My question has to do, it's kind of dovetailed onto that one with the early spying. Samantha Powers signed over 300 unmasking requests, yet she says she did not sign them. Are we going to haul her back up and get some more information? How can she just be excused saying, well, I didn't sign these? You know, who did?
Right. Somebody needs to find out who did that. That may also take a grand jury because she's no longer with the government. The Inspector General can only interview people who are still with the government. And that's one of my theories as to why Attorney General Barr asked Rosenstein to stay on, both to help clean up the mess he had made big time with respect to appointing Mueller in the first place, and to, supervise the conclusion of the report and put his name on it, and also to give him access, or to give the Inspector General access to Mr. Rosenstein at the same time.
Say that again.
You can't be pulled in front of a grand jury if you've left the government.
No, the Inspector General only has jurisdiction over people that are still employed by the government. It would take a grand jury to interview people who have left the government. Or FBI agents could go out and interview them, but you can't compel that. You can compel them to come testify in front of a grand jury.
So Sidney, I had submitted a question earlier today through email, and it refers to what I call the Clinton-Obama Justice Department cabal, and the fact that they've been incestuously intertwined for 20 years in so many atrocities, it's just mind-boggling. Do you really feel that Horowitz is clean? I mean, everybody thought Mueller was clean, but he's not. He's had his finger in so many things. Rosenstein's been tied to it. Are we going to get justice?
Well, Horowitz is one of 56 Obama-appointed inspector generals who actually complained to Congress about Obama shutting down their access to everything they needed to do their jobs. And he led that fight. In fact, he was actually given the job under false pretenses. Between the time he was given the job as Inspector General and the time he got into the job, Holder had come in and changed the rules on his access to information within DOJ. And then as soon as Sally Yates got in, she completely shut off his access to the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, which of course was doing all the spying and overseeing the FISA applications and all of that. And I forgot to mention earlier, John Carlin, who was head of the National Security Division, resigned the same day that Admiral Rogers blew the whistle on the FISA abuses, and right after they rushed the Carter Page application through. So he needs to be in front of a grand jury.
But you're optimistic?
Be optimistic. I think his prior support was suppressed in a lot of ways, that his conclusions were not actually his conclusions because his conclusions did not match the content of the report. The content of the report was damning as to bias, but yet his conclusions found no bias, no direct evidence of bias. In other words, nobody wrote a note home to mom that says, I'm really biased here. But there was evidence of bias throughout the report.
All right, so Sidney, in the meantime, you want to make the announcements if they haven't heard about Rosenstein.
Oh yeah, Rosenstein resigned today, effective May 11th, if you had not heard that news blast.
Ready?
Thank you for your work. Thank you for your presentation. It's very important. Does your book cover the issue of Shadow President Jared Kushner? And if not, what can you tell us about Shadow President Jared Kushner?
It does not cover Mr. Kushner. Mr. Kushner was he owned and was the publisher of the New York Observer, for which I started writing pieces back when I wrote the book. They were the first ones interested in publishing, and the only ones, frankly, interested in publishing my pieces on prosecutorial misconduct, which I found interesting because technically the Observer is a liberal outlet. But Mr. Kushner's father was convicted by Chris Christie's office when Christie was U.S. Attorney. And the Kushner family has a soft spot in their heart for wrongful prosecutions and prosecutorial misconduct. I don't know the details of the Kushner case. I can tell you I was never a fan of Chris Christie's tactics as a prosecutor. He was one of the ones that enjoyed tactics that I firmly disapprove of, as I have discussed with respect to Mr. Weissman. So I don't know any of the details of that case, but I was pleased that, and I've always thought warmly of Jared because of that. I do wonder about some of the issues that he has influence over in the White House. I think some things his input is probably good on, and other things I would rather he not weigh in on. I think the president has certain signature issues like immigration that he has a very strong commitment to his voter base to stick to the plan. I have some concerns that Mr. Kushner has adversely influenced that and is working on, in fact, I've seen it reported that Mr. Kushner is working on a plan to expand legal immigration when 70% of the country has polled as saying they don't want any more legal immigration, that we even think legal immigration needs to be curtailed somewhat, and certainly when we have over 40 million illegal immigrants here. So that's, I think, probably all I can say intelligently on the Kushner subject.
Good evening. My question is to receive your opinion if it would be beneficial for society, American citizens, if there was a term limit for federal judges, maybe of 17 years, or federal prosecutors.
I think there should be a term limit on everybody in the federal government completely.
elected to their positions.
I even think for elected, I really do. I mean, that's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot. Harvey Silverglade, who wrote 3 felonies a day, that's often paired on Amazon with my book, he and I are working on a book called Conviction Machine that is going to suggest solutions for reform of the criminal justice system. And one of the things we're recommending is term limits for all government employees, with the possible exception of the military. And generally, I think lots of people in the military retire after 20 years. But I think, 15 years total in the government should be the limit for anybody and everybody. And for Congress and the Senate, Senator Cruz has proposed a term limit bill for 2 terms for senators and 3 for congressmen. That would give senators 12 years, which is plenty of time. And that would only give congressmen 6 years. I would suggest, if I were voting and had a vote there on it, I'd say 5 terms for congressmen and 2 for senators. That would give congressmen 10 years and senators 12, and that would put them all past consecutive terms for a president, which I think makes sense. And the same for federal judges. 15 years for a federal judge should be plenty of time. We'd lose some good ones. I realize that. There are some, very good judges on the bench. But I would also suggest that presidents postpone the age at which they're appointing judges. I forgot which president started it, but they started, kind of trying to pack the court with people that are very young. Well, I was young once and thought I would have made a great judge, but, experience counts for a lot. And a broad range of experience counts for even more. One of our recommendations is also going to be that you never appoint anybody to a federal bench straight out of a job as a federal prosecutor. We don't need prosecutors sitting on the bench in robes. They should have at least had some experience as defense attorneys, and they should not go straight from being a prosecutor to being a federal judge. That happens way too often. We just need to broaden it all out, and they don't always need for the Republicans to have come from the Federalist Society either. As much as I think of the Federalist Society, there are lawyers all over the country that are very good lawyers that would make good judges who have never been a member of the Federalist Society.
I read your book and I appreciate your writing, and I have to admit it was draining to read it, but it was because it was so incredible. If it was fiction, you would say it couldn't have occurred. But I think I remember in the book that you said that you were a prosecutor, I believe, for 10 years, and then you went to defending people. And my question I had, and maybe you answered it and I missed it in the book, but why did you make that decision?
Well, I actually went into civil practice. I've only accepted about 5 or 6 cases as a criminal defense lawyer, and only if I'm convinced that, frankly, most people who are charged with a crime, probably 85% of them did it. Our system is pretty much on target there. But in the ones that I've taken as a defense lawyer, I felt like either they didn't do it or something had happened that was very wrong along the way and needed fixing. And so far that's proved correct. You develop an instinct for when something just doesn't add up. But largely I do civil cases.
What I was wondering is, in the questioning of Flynn, that he was prosecuted for a while in the FBI, was there any action that really should have been taken against the people who organized the questioning? It strikes me as that was a terribly inappropriate thing to do in the first place.
I think we're going to learn more about that in the 2 Inspector General reports that are coming out. He's asking about the questioning of General Flynn when Agent Pienka and Peter Stroke were dispatched by Comey and McCabe to do the ambush interview of him just a few days after he started his job as NSA director in the White House. I think even more is going to come out on that every day, and that whole thing was just horrible. There's nothing right about the way that was handled. And I am as sure as I am standing here that the FBI reports, the 302s they call them, that have been produced to the defense does not include the original 302, and that the government's production to the defense tries to obfuscate that. They wrote a letter that they submitted one that had draft on it, and I would bet money that McCabe had significant influence over revising that 302, and the defense should be requesting more documents of that, and there's a file and kind of a log that the FBI keeps of the hands that it all goes through. I mean, normally the agent comes back, sits down that day, writes out the 302, sticks it in the file. This one went through a long and arduous process of being revised and edited and moved around and God only knows what, which reminds me of the Fastow 302 and the Enron case. They actually wound up, Fastow was interviewed for thousands of hours by the agents after he decided to cooperate. He was Enron's guru CFO, the architect of all the frauds. And then finally, after they indicted his wife and sent her to prison to get his attention, that was another Weissman move. He really decided he'd cooperate. So they not only did multiple 302s of him, they threw out all the original 302s and did a composite 302 that was heavily edited and smoothed and destroyed all the original 302s. Flagrant violation. Got by with it completely.
The Constitution, as I understand it, gave us 3 equal branches of government. It's something that I don't understand, and that never, but it really was brought to mind when the federal judge blocked Trump's first travel ban. How can a lower court federal judge stop the executive branch if there are 3 co-equal branches of government? That means the courts are absolutely supreme and there's no recourse.
Well, there is a recourse in several different ways. One is the Justice Department needs to fight back a lot harder on accepting this notion of any kind of national injunction. That is horse feathers. We didn't used to have those, and they only have jurisdiction over the case and the parties in front of them. To expand it to cover the entire country, it just doesn't fly. In fact, one of the ways the Supreme Court actually takes a case is through the evolution of different views from the different courts of appeals as cases percolate up through the system. They look for circuit splits before the Supreme Court takes a case. I.e., the Ninth Circuit has decided the issue one way, the Fifth Circuit has decided the case another, and they even look for what they call deep splits, where 4 circuits have lined up one way and 5 circuits have lined up the other. Well, with this nationwide injunction thing, you get one district court deciding something for the whole country. It's absurd. Absolutely absurd. So, I mean, if I were advising the executive branch, I wouldn't even follow it outside that district in that particular narrow set of circumstances.
I think Jefferson once said, the Supreme Court has made its decision, let them enforce it.
Yeah. Right.
That was Jackson.
Jackson, Robert Jackson.
Much more than personality.
Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
My question is based on the premise that we are a nation of laws and we have equal justice under the law. Given the current climate of investigations, including John Huber, Devin Nunes, Lindsey Graham, Inspector Horowitz, all of these as collective investigations, do you expect there to be any indictments into the non-investigation of Hillary Clinton? She was never charged, so she was never exonerated. The investigation didn't really exist. So do you expect any indictments whatsoever based on all of these collective investigations?
I do.
Would you name any names?
I know Attorney General Barr is reestablishing the rule of law. And I was very pleased to see an indictment for aiding and abetting by the U.S. Attorney in Massachusetts of the state judge who facilitated the escape of the illegal alien from ICE. The same principle can apply to sanctuary city mayors and sheriffs. And needs to be applied there, and I'm hopeful that that will take place. I've been arguing about that for months publicly. So yes, I mean, again, we'll know a lot more when we see the Inspector General's reports. I understand there are criminal referrals in them. I've heard, of course, that Devin Nunes has sent over a number of criminal referrals. I'm sure some of those are going to contain false statements in front of Congress. I would expect one of those to be Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS. But also Mr. Comey, and of course we know there are already 3 criminal referral counts on Andrew McCabe. So it's high time that indictments start being handed down for the people who have obviously lied to Congress and done other things that other people have already been indicted for that they didn't do.
I love the word horse feathers. I think it applies to just about the platform of every Democratic candidate that has since put their name in for the presidency. So I'd like to ask, first of all, an observation and then an answer. Of all the candidates that are coming forth in the Democratic melee, I'd like your opinion on who might rise to the top. And the answer I'd like is the Obama-Jarrett cabal. Who do you think they're going to back?
You're talking to somebody that has no political savvy whatsoever. I have no idea. I'm not sure they want any of them. I'm really not.
I don't think it's closed yet. I think we're going to find a couple more show up.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if Michelle Obama decided to run. Yeah. I don't know.
Hey, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you.
I really have 3 names or groups of names that I'd love to ask you to comment on as much as you would like.
Okay.
And then a final question. So the first name is Michael Cohen.
Slime ball.
Jeff Sessions, black hat or white hat?
Very honorable and good man, untenable position, and just not the right person at the right time.
That's right. Okay, and then these 4 names go together. Joseph Mifsud, Stephen Halper, George Papadopoulos, and Michael Caputo.
Michael Caputo and George Papadopoulos, well, Papadopoulos, yeah, he just, God bless him, he was in the wrong person, wrong place, wrong time, just had no idea what the hell he was doing. Caputo, I'm really glad he spoke out. He did the world a favor by speaking out and going on the offensive. For a lot of people, he helped by doing that. I think they tried to set him up in a big way. Misford and Downer were the other 2. Halper. Both slime balls working for the FBI CIA.
And the last is October 5th, 2017 is the day that the New York Times outed Harvey Weinstein. It is also the day that the president was captured in the White House with an array of his military leaders, and he uttered the phrase, "calm before the storm," where the press asked a follow-up and said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You will see." What significance, if any, do you attach to those 2 activities, episodes occurring on the same day, October 5th, 2017?
Yeah, I don't, attach any. I have no idea.
Do you know what he meant by the calm before the storm?
He probably had an inkling that a lot more information was going to be coming out.
Okay, I'll leave. Thanks. All right, let me get this gentleman's hat asked, and then you come right back.
In the Ted Stevens case, Alaska Senator Ted Stevens, in the Arthur Anderson case, and in the Merrill Lynch case, you point out in your book that exculpatory information, Brady material, being withheld by the prosecutors, the federal prosecutors, was the reason that these people were found guilty, and ultimately their cases reversed. Question is, do you think that there's been a serious control of withholding that type of information in the federal courts? Has happened any progress with regard to controlling that so that those things don't happen again?
No, I think it's a big problem. It's a big problem in federal courts writ large, and it's an even bigger problem in the Mueller investigation. Yeah.
I'm really the other guy's twin. I'd like to get your thoughts about Uranium One and the Clinton pay-to-play access schemes. They're somewhat related, but the FBI had an informant, or CIA, I don't remember one, maybe both, within the whole Uranium One deal in Russia and Rosatom and everything else. Victoria Tenzing, I think, was representing him when he presented in front of Congress last fall. We've heard nothing of it. Is that another cover-up on the Clinton Foundation?
Yeah, I think it is. I think the reason Hillary's secret server existed to begin with was to hide the Uranium One information and all the pay-to-play stuff, so that all the corruption with the Clinton Foundation and Uranium One and her Secretary of State and the pay-to-play could all be handled and in the one thing. I also think the reason it's been covered up is because, well, we know Barack Obama was emailing her on the server using an alias. So if he was, and if that was their only means of communication, which is undisputed, then we know that anybody else who wanted to communicate with her, such as counsel Catherine Rumler, who is named in my book, Obama's counterterrorism advisor Lisa Monaco, who is named in my book, Robert Mueller, who was then FBI director and supposedly flew a sample of uranium over to Russia on the FBI jet. He would have had to have emailing her on that secret server. As lawyers, they would have all known that they shouldn't be doing that she shouldn't be doing that. There have to be at least 100 high-ranking government officials who were using aliases or something, whatever, to email her on that secret server. So it goes broad, deep, wide, every which way you want to cover it, for a lot of people in DC being implicated in deep kimchi on Hillary's server. Yeah. And pay to play and Uranium One.
Sidney, thank you for coming this evening. The topic is awareness, building awareness. This is what I would call preaching to the choir. In the building awareness side, this guy, Andrew Weissman, is so objectionable and open for ridicule. Arthur Anderson, the Supreme Court ruling, the stuff on the other stuff, whatever.
Yeah, the Merrill Lynch guys.
Merrill Lynch, thank you. The question is this: have you been approached to make a movie or made-for-TV movie? We'll talk.
Can we all begin?
Yeah, there are a couple of people that have mentioned it and are reading the book, but nothing, that seems like it's going to pan out.
I've heard reported that all 4 FISA applications for surveillance on the Trump campaign were approved without a hearing. I've also heard reported that 95+% of FISA applications are approved. That sounds like a rubber stamp operation to me, and I wonder if you can disabuse me of the notion that no one is overseeing the FISA court's operation.
Well, you're wrong about one thing. It's more like 99.9% are approved. And it is a rubber stamp. They trust the government way too much on it. Congress really needs to pull it back. Of course, they're terrorized literally by film of people jumping out of the buildings on 9/11. That's what the FBI shows them every time the FISA issue comes up. They bring in all the freshman congressmen and show them the pictures of people falling from the building on 9/11 to tell them how important it is to re-up all the FISA authority. But no, something definitely needs to be done about that, particularly when they're seeking a FISA application against an American citizen, since it's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And so far, we haven't even been able to identify who wrote the FISA applications, and everybody who has testified or spoken about it says that they signed off on it, but they didn't verify anything and they didn't read it, including Mr. Comey. I mean, that alone is grounds for prosecution because you're signing a verified application to a federal court. It's a federal false statement to do that. I don't even sign a brief to the Fifth Circuit without having read it if it's got my name on it. And Rosenstein says, oh, I was briefed on it. Who gets briefed on just a 50-page document that's the most intrusive of all applications against an American citizen that allows the federal government to go back and do anything they ever did in their life, every keystroke they took, every digital contact they ever had, all their credit card records, I mean, you name it, they've got it. Shaking my head.
So thanks for being here and talking to us. It's really interesting to get your perspective, especially sort of your insider perspective of what might actually be getting traction. On the topic of Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, we've got a lot of smoking guns with Uranium One and some, other, we think bad acts. We believe, we know bad acts. Al Capone ultimately was taken down for tax evasion. Right. A guy named Charles Ortel, I don't know.
I know Charles, we're friends.
So Charles, his work on, uncovering just the fraudulent structure of the Clinton Foundation and the illegal structure of the Clinton Foundation and just their paperwork is wrong. Is that an opportunity? Is there real traction there? As that being an opportunity to take down the Clintons and the Clinton Foundation?
Yes. Yeah, there's plenty of information out there.
But is there traction in the right quarters? Is there traction?
I have no idea what, if anything, Mr. Huber is doing. I have zero information on anything Mr. Huber is doing. I know he has not interviewed Joe and Victoria's client on the Uranium One thing. I don't know what, if anything, he's doing on the Clinton Foundation stuff, but there are a lot of people out there with a lot of information about the Clinton Foundation, and I do think this Attorney General is interested in pursuing justice.
But if you talk to Mr. Rotel, please tell him that me and my sister are his biggest fans. Thank you.
All right, it's 8:20. We want to have enough time for book signing and a little more chatting. So 2 people have additional questions. Is there anybody that has not asked a question that wants to get up here because this is last call? Has everybody had a good time?
Yeah.
Yes. All right, the quick question. Your question.
Okay. So I would agree that our problems did not begin with Obama, but a lot of this sort of goes back to that era. And my question is that
he perfected it.
Right. That my recollection of the situation is that we still know virtually nothing about his background, his identity, his schooling, his who he actually is. And is there any interest in that is playing into this at this point?
Not that I know of.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll give a fast string and then a quick comment is, do you know Joe DeGeneva and why did he not stay in the White House Defense Council? Also, do you know the journalism of Lee Stranahan? And why has Mitch McConnell rolled over? And my statement is that I accuse Richard Burr and Tom Tillis of malfeasance and nonfeasance.
Joe and I are friends. Joe and Victoria and I are friends. I think the world of both of them. They had a conflict of interest because they represent other witnesses in the case, and so they couldn't represent the president. Lee Stranahan, I follow him on Twitter. I am aware of him. What were the other two?
McConnell.
McConnell, oh, I can't stand him.
And Burr.
Hashtag ditch Mitch. Total swamp. And on top of that, his wife has significant financial interests in China, and there's a conflict of interest there, and I don't understand why she's in the position she's in, except perhaps to, yeah. And Mitch really sold him out on the immigration bill. And totally. I mean,
Now, I had lunch today with some individuals who were discussing this matter, and I proposed the question, is the root of all of this problem the fact that the National Security Act of 1947 prohibited the CIA to do investigation and analysis and espionage on domestic individuals, and that they made an arrangement in the 1950s, which was then enhanced by the Clinton administration, to swap. In other words, the British would spy on American citizens, and the American intelligence agencies would spy on the British citizens. And that the source of this is really trying to cover up and trying to enhance politically what was once a very cozy arrangement between the two intelligence agencies.
They were going to figure out a way to do it, I'm sure, no matter what. But what they wound up with is a conspiracy to violate our own laws by our own intelligence agencies. And that's what we're witnessing play out.
Real quick.
You mentioned you favor term limits in Washington, D.C. in general. What is the legal mechanism by which you would make that happen? It requires a constitutional amendment. Congress is never going to do that.
Yeah, that's a problem.
This is our call to action.
Right. Well, they could pass a statute if they would do that. It could be declared unconstitutional if somebody challenged it, but the presumption would be that if they actually passed a statute, it would be followed.